Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Ramona Burress, and I will be your moderator for this conversation this evening around clinical trials and their role in our community. I serve as Associate Director of JANSSEN Pharmaceuticals, and I'm so happy to be joined this evening by Dr. Kevin Pruitt. So, Kevin Pruitt, Dr. Pruitt, would you mind introducing yourself, giving us a little bit about your background, and get us started to talking about why clinical trials has been such an issue in our community?
Good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Kevin Pruitt. I'm a Chief Medical Scientist for PBJ Medical and a medical consultant for Kemet Medical Consultants. I graduated from the University of Science and Technology with a degree in medicine and also a PhD in biomedical science. I have published over 20 peer-reviewed medical journals, including emergency medicine and ICU, just to name a few. My main focus of research is primarily on minority health. Now, to answer your question, Dr. Burgess, I believe medical mistrust runs high in part because of the nation's history of ethical practices in medical research on African Americans, point blank. It's rooted in the history of exploitation and of experimentation on African Americans that range from, of course, everybody's heard about the Tuskegee syphilis study to the 19th century doctor experimentation on gynecological treatment with enslaved Black women, of course. So I understand the Black community does not feel comfortable or may not want to be in experiments, especially when they're sick and not feeling well and they're trying to fight some disease state such as cancer. But even if medical research can lead to better outcomes, I'm here to give you some better understanding tonight.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so happy to have you to share your expertise in this space and really want to tie in clinical trials and their roles when we look at certain health conditions that we know disproportionately affect our community, African American men in particular. So, one of those being prostate cancer. And I'm going to share some data that we have with the disparities of prostate cancer in our community and hoping that we can give a narrative to why, again, it's important for us to be represented and participating in clinical trials, but specifically to prostate cancer.
Yeah, great point. I think doctors may have underestimated the risk of death from low-grade prostate cancer in Black males. First, let me say that. Typically, men with low-grade forms of disease will die from something other than cancer. So there is a need to acknowledge that certain biological factors may play a part in low-grade prostate cancer as it continues to grow and spread faster within the Black men population, more so than other races. Genetically, it's been discovered that Black men are more likely to have at least six different biomarkers for prostate cancer, which is different than other men.
Yeah, this is interesting. I'm looking at some of the data, and it says that, Black men compared to white men are twice as likely to die. Of the data as to why, there's stigma around African American men in general seeking care when it comes to prostate cancer. But jumping right into transition into clinical trials, can you give us, what is a clinical trial? Define that for us.
What is a clinical trial? Okay, let's jump right into clinical trial here. How can I explain it so that everybody understand it? Basically, it's just investigational medicine for drugs, vaccine treatments, different apparatus that are approved for use for the public. So before it can be approved for use for the public, it has to be clinical research be conducted. It can be conducted into human species most of the time. Sometimes it can be conducted in animal species. But it's important part of the creation and discovery of new medicines and treatment because it allows the medical community to understand how safe and beneficial potential medications, and of course, we're in a pandemic, so vaccines and other treatments may be.
Yeah, that's so important. And so we talk about, again, the need for us to be represented in clinical trials, but how does this tie into the overall disparity conversation that we have in healthcare in general? Like, by urging folks to consider being participants in clinical trial, what does that help us resolve?
A couple of things. Let me just put out a few things here. Clinical trials are voluntary research studies involving people, and is designed to evaluate how different factors like age, race, and ethnicity may play an impact in the safety and effectiveness of investigational medicines or treatment. As I mentioned before, the safety and well-being of the participants are of the utmost importance in clinical trials. You said, can you share some of the other information? Absolutely. Let's go into even further. African Americans remain the least healthiest subgroup in the United States, from a very lengthy social and racial injustice in society, creating formidable challenges around equal care in the past. Certain disease states, as we know, cardiovascular disease, infectious disease like HIV, and many forms of cancer, including prostate cancer, as we're talking about tonight, lung cancer. There's also multiple myeloma, on and on, that might affect certain people more than others because of our biological makeup and ethnicity background. Similarly, our bodies respond different to medication and treatment, including how safe they are and how well they work, and they may differ on such factors as race, ethnicity, gender, age, and other.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm looking at some of the data that we have here on the slides, and it gives us a snapshot of 2014 when we look at the various clinical trials, and actually more than various, 10,000 clinical trials that were funded by the National Cancer Institute. They're noting that fewer than 2% were considered to be folks of color, so Black and
Mhm.
brown.
Mhm.
So it's interesting that we have this data here, but again, like, how do we change the narrative? This has become an important topic since we've been in COVID, but these are issues that have been present as we see here with 2014 before COVID even, hit us. So why is diversity so important? Like, again, we have 2% of representation in these clinical trials since 2014. Why do we keep pushing the issue? Why is this so important?
Absolutely, Dr. Burgess. African Americans, simply put, aren't represented in clinical trials, and not only is that injustice to us, it's also a disadvantage actually for clinical research. Patient populations presenting in clinical trials for studies of investigational medicine and drugs have been skewed very heavily towards white population. In some cases, I've seen trials where up to 80 to 90% of the participants have been Caucasian. So, we definitely need to get ourselves involved if we're going to do investigational drugs on ourselves. And some of let me go through just for our audience real quick, some of the advantages that we can look at. It may seem obvious, but segments of the population are not included in clinical trials. I just mentioned that some studies are up to 90% Caucasian. And that level is that we need to get our people in. We need to get a population and enough numbers where it's clinically significant. So that doesn't mean 2 or 3 people. That means we need to have quite a bit of people to get some type of statistical significance. It's impossible to determine if therapies in question work equally better, the same, or worse in African Americans if we don't study in African Americans. The goal is to include a population that represents the community suffering from the disease, as we are talking about prostate cancer tonight. As you said, 2.2 times more likely for African Americans to die from prostate cancer than other races. So, as we try to treat, help ensure the safety, efficacy, and investigational medications and study, we need to be involved in those studies. Various organizations, as you see tonight, such as Black Health Matters, have written exclusively about the lack of diversity in clinical trials. I come to you today just to bring greater clarity to the general audience and hopefully our African American community, and understanding on how clinical trials work, especially with African American men and prostate cancer. So clinical trials, basically, Dr. Borges, we must be more inclusive, and we must work towards creating safe and effective medications that work for patients who need them the most, regardless of race and ethnicity.
Thank you, Dr. Pruitt, for that. I think it's great background for all of us, even myself being in healthcare. I know that even when I talk to family members and, some of my peers who are in healthcare as well, too, there's this misnomer, like we don't know what clinical trials, really means. It kind of sounds overwhelming for a lot of us, again, even those of us who are health professionals. So can you like drill down, like what exactly is a clinical trial? What is a phase 1 versus a phase 4? Because I think, this is probably the first time ever in our lifetime that we've been talking about clinical trials at the dinner table. So I really want to just take this opportunity for folks to walk away with, okay, this is what a clinical trial really entails, and this is why there are so many different phases to get us to eventually having drugs and products on the market.
Absolutely. And I'll go through this kind of slow, just so everybody can kind of follow. As you said, there are 4 phases. Phase 1, the first study in humans, that's when you take a substance and study it in humans. It's usually a small group of healthy individuals, usually 20 to 100 participants, mostly healthy, like I said. And the main objective in that phase, which is clinical 1, is safety of the medication. So we're trying to make sure that it's safe, how the medication is absorbed of the body and what doses should be used, how the study medication is removed from the body. Technical word of that is pharmacokinetics, and potential side effects that we tend to see or not see based on what the drug compound perpetuates. On to phase 2, small studies. Now, the key thing here is they're going to increase when you go through the phases, the amount of participants. So we topped off at about 100 on phase 1. Now we're going to increase from about 100 to 500 participants. And the main objective on phase 2 is to investigate ongoing safety, as always, whether the study medication works for a particular disease. So we're going to look for what we're studying. If we're trying to study hypertension, we're going to make sure this drug works for hypertension. For example, and the best dose of the study medication, 10 milligrams versus 20. And so this is where we get all the, what the technical term is, the pharmacodynamics of the medication. Not to get too technical, but that's what they call it. And if it passes phase 2, we move on to phase 3. On this one, we usually call these large studies with around 500 or more participants. So as I said, we moved up in our participant pool that we're studying in. And these are the main study for the final approval for health authorities. So phase 3 is very important. The main objective in phase 3 basically is, as I said, from phase 1, 2, and 3 is safety. Is it safe? The side effects in a bigger population. Whether the study medication works for a particular disease. Does it work for hypertension, like we said? How the treatment compares to an already existing standard therapy. Is it better than typical hypertensive meds that are already on the market? Is it worse? And so we'll do a comparison in phase 3 and make sure everything is in line for moving to phase 4. Phase 4. Even larger studies. You're going to study the medication. Is once it moves to phase 4, everybody, it's been approved. And so you're going to study this, what we call in the general population. It's going to be ongoing monitoring. And basically the main objective of phase 4 is ongoing monitoring after it hits the market. Side effects, day-to-day use in the population. Because day-to-day use in the population, we have a wider variety of genetic pool out there, and so you'll start seeing different things may affect different people. So it's ongoing monitoring. Risks and benefits over a longer period of time. Sometimes it takes a longer period of time to get all the benefits or any type of untoward reactions you may have. So phase 4 is the ongoing monitoring the benefits over a period of time. I hope that answers your question, and I hope I went slow enough for everybody.
Yeah, that's great. Before we jump into mistrust, I do want to highlight that safety is priority when it comes through going through all these phases. As we see here on the screen, phase 1 is safety of the medication to see again how it's absorbed by the body and what dosage needs to be used. Phase 2, again, safety is paramount to make sure that the medication works for the disease state that it's going to be indicated for, and to do further study from that phase 1 model into phase 2. And then phase 3, of course, is continued safety, but also side effects and efficacy measured in larger groups. So thank you, Dr. Pruitt, for walking us through. But again, I want the audience to walk away that safety is always paramount as we move through the stages of these clinical trials. And so, with that, Dr. Pruitt, I want to transition into the mistrust that we know, again, exists in our communities, but not just African Americans. It exists across communities because of some of the historical ills that you mentioned in the beginning of our session. So can we just talk about what do we have in place for safeguarding, again, safety of those who choose to participate in clinical trials? What has changed since the days of Tuskegee?
Yes, absolutely. Very, clinical research has a complicated history when it comes to minority populations, as we all know. Because of past events, many involving the minority community, we continue to distrust clinical research. So it's important to help people understand how the clinical trial process has been changed and evolved to ensure, once again, what you emphasize, patient safety and human rights are protected. So let me just go through a few things that are different from back then, if I can take a minute to embellish, Dr. Burgess. Today, all clinical trials must follow strict and standard procedures, as you know, to ensure all participants are safely monitored, as you emphasize safety, both legally and human rights are protected. The discussion to participate, if you do decide to discuss with the family and make a decision to participate in a clinical research, it's totally voluntary. You have total autonomy on your decision. Point blank, there's no other way around it. Before enrolling in a clinical trial, which everybody needs to understand out here, participants must receive the information about what to expect throughout the trial in a document called the informed consent, which will have a bulk of the information needed to give you details, very deep details about the clinical study and to help family members and yourself make a decision. During the process, participants are educated, which is, I just talked about, educated about the study, associate risks that might be experienced during the study and different things. And people may notice that as the patient bill of rights, which is a common term used for that. You are given an opportunity to ask questions if you enter a study. You can also take the time to discuss the study. As I always tell people, discuss it with your family, discuss it with your doctor, and people you trust. Don't make that decision by yourself, because that decision, you can do with a group of people that you care about and what's best for you. Here's a big thing that I want to emphasize is at any time that you enter a clinical trial, you can withdraw from the trial. You don't need to give an explanation. You don't need to give a reason. You have total power to withdraw at any time. And I often get questions from people who say, oh my God, if I enter the study, I won't be able to get out. That's not true. You can withdraw at any time you feel the need to. Pharmaceutical companies actually have developed the study medications that you're responsible for receiving in most of your study protocols. They'll invent the study design, they'll do the monitoring and the execution of the clinical trials. We have a very important thing that I'm getting ready to tell you, and that is, it's called the Institutional Review Board. And the Institutional Review Board is an independent committee responsible for ensuring that clinical trial processes are ethical, are conducted in a human and caring way, they're appropriate, they protect the participants' rights, and you're going to be cared for throughout the process of the clinical trial. So I would like everybody to, if you don't know, the Institutional Review Board is a very key thing. Federal agencies such as the Food and Drug Administration are also responsible for reviewing clinical trial protocols. The pharmaceutical companies, in conjunction with the FDA, ensure that all clinical trials are conducted properly and to determine the safety, as Dr. Burgess said, and efficacy before investigational medicines are approved by the FDA for public use. And once again, safety. Safety is the top priority of clinical trials, as we said multiple times tonight.
I love it. Thank you, Dr. Pruitt, because I want this to be an opportunity for folks to get answers to the questions that they have, because we do know the more that we continue to have these conversations, the more pearls of wisdom that folks can walk away with, and that education is empowerment. And I'm so happy that you reminded the audience that even if you enroll in a clinical trial, you have the right to walk away. If you don't feel like that's something that you want to pursue or continue with, you have that right. So thank you for reiterating that. And I guess on a larger scale, because I'm a pharmacist, you're a physician, what can we do to change those numbers that we were looking at earlier, where it shows that we're so underrepresented in clinical trials? We talked about prostate cancer earlier today, but those numbers are pretty much the same no matter whether you're looking at it for diabetes, cardiovascular trials, HIV, what have you. So what role do we as healthcare providers play to change this dynamic?
A couple of things, and before we talk about that, we first must understand some of the factors on why people reject entering into a clinical trial, and that's going to be the most important thing. And what we found, through my research, and I'm sure Black Health Matters and other groups, such as diversity groups like yourself, is they dislike being randomized into one particular arm. So let's say I have a disease and I'm going to be in what they call the non-treatment. They don't like being randomized and not knowing what they're going. And I'm just giving you some of the feedback on what we're hearing out in the community. Unease with the clinical protocols and apprehensive about treatment side effects. Once again, we emphasize safety, but people are very concerned about the side effects. Constraints of travel have always been a problem. People who enter trials, you're going to be required to possibly go to a center to be monitored, and sometimes people don't have the necessary travel means to get there. Taking time off work is always a big problem. If you need to get to the clinic to be measured for, and you're in a clinical trial in the middle of your workday, that's a problem. And so family constraints, the cost of having to travel and stay long periods of time to receive care, and just access to clinical trials are some of the barriers that we face commonly in the clinical trial arena. My big thing now is, what are the solutions? And I'm sure you want to hear some of the solutions. What I've found over the years is, if we create, clinical trials to engage a target community around a recruitment plan, we have better success. And that means going into a community, having a plan on how we're going to get people in that community engaged in what we want to do brings better trust and commitment and everything to entering into a clinical trial and seeing it to the end. So once again, bring the community to the table early in the planning stage. Listen to their input. Don't make assumptions. Listen to the input and see what best reaches them. Hear their concerns. Obviously, Dr. Burress, that's a big one. Attempt to address them. Educate them about the importance of clinical trials. People hear clinical trials all the time, but that doesn't mean they understand it. And so education is a big part of making a decision once you understand the ins and outs of the clinical trial and what your rights are and what potential benefit it can be. The church. We all know the ground zero for the Black community is the church. So if we engage the Black church, get educational programs in there through church groups, we found that we have a tremendous response when we involve the church. Absolutely. Partnering with minority medical groups is also, we're doing that tonight with Black Health Matters. We do the National Medical Association, the Pharmaceutical Association, all different ones that are minority groups. When they see healthcare officials that look like them, they're more likely to be trusting and be more eager to see how they can help, and also just to be a participant in getting our community well. And so that's a very, very good point and take home thing to see. Once again, information and educational. I can't emphasize that enough. Mainly people aren't educated, and because of that, they don't tend to make the decision to enter clinical trials. Outreach to community groups, families, different other groups that may not be medical. You have different groups in the community that have various outreaches and deep hands into our community that we can use. Here's a big thing that I want to bring to light is, and I think we often miss it, is our younger generation. We don't ask them. And they're young enough to enter in, they're healthy, and of course, for them, many of them are young enough, they may not have the medical mistrust of some of the older generation because they didn't live through that time period. And they may be more apt to enter into clinical trials to help us obtain a certain level of medical knowledge that we may need. So I don't want us to not engage the young community because say, oh, they're not sick, but that's not an excuse not to engage them and get them involved, because we do have various pediatric and young adult diseases, obviously. Mm-hmm. Our historical Black fraternities and sororities, that I'm here representing Omega Psi Phi Fraternity today, we have a deep reach in our community through community service, and so do other sororities and Black fraternities. And so we are also a voice in the community to bring forth change. And so we can definitely foster that change by getting in our community and encouraging our community to get involved. And while it's important to recruit minority participants in clinical trials, not just recruitment is important, but also keeping them in the clinical trial. If we enroll 1,000 people and 500 leave, and I talked about that earlier, clinical significance, we need to keep a clinically significant portion of those enrollees enrolled in that study so that we actually can reach some type of significance and make a conclusion about the research when we have enough participants. So we want to make sure that we actually engage them and keep them. And some of the ways that I found out over my time is scheduling helps. It's a major barrier sometimes, but it definitely helps. If we schedule things around, there may be childcare, there may be transportation issues that I mentioned earlier, or work-related issues. So if we can schedule those things around their daily lifestyle and it's not a hindrance to them, they often will be more amenable to joining into clinical trials. And some of the other things that I really wanted to emphasize before I wrap up, Dr. Burgess, is another reason clinical trial recruitment strategies often don't work is sometimes the centers where they do the clinical recruitment aren't convenient for our minority communities. If it's a 30, 40-minute drive outside of where they're established or where they, lay their head or see their community, they may not be inclined to do that commute. I know Black Health Matters is in Atlanta. The commute in Atlanta and that traffic may be prohibitive if it's too far away and that clinical trial is not located somewhere convenient for somebody to get access in our community, just to give an example. So we must establish sites at clinical positions and areas in our community that are convenient for our minority population. So it may be beneficial to open up a site right in the minority community, recruit and conduct the research right there, and maybe hire African Americans to do the actual study.
Yes.
Right there, which may be beneficial. So just some of these different strategies and some of the things that we've come up with should help, if we can, some of our recruitment. We're really in need of Black males recruiting in for prostate cancer. And hopefully tonight just brought in some general idea and gave some scratch the surface information on how clinical trials work and what your rights are and what your rights aren't and what you need to do and some solutions that we have in our community.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Pruitt. This was great. I love these type of conversations because, you really push the fact that this is a shared responsibility, from us as healthcare providers, from where I sit, from now working for pharma, where we sponsor these clinical trials, and also for the community as well, too. But, from a pharma perspective, we are actively, especially at JANSSEN, working to make sure we diversify the sites that we use, so we're really looking at community hospitals, federally qualified health.
Okay, I think her system froze up for a minute, but I'm glad she started touching on just do some of the things that we mentioned tonight, which was recruitment in areas and different healthcare models that we can for the Black community. I'm sorry, Dr. Burgess, you froze off for a minute.
Yeah, I know. I don't know. Somebody was trying to cut me
I'll
off,
let
keep
you
me
pick
from being
back
great.
up. I'll let you pick back up, but I was just steering the audience, just emphasizing some of the facts that you were talking about, which is what your company was doing as far as to helping this cause of
Yeah, but
recruitment.
just really honing in that it's a shared responsibility, and I want to address some of the questions in the chat as well too. A couple of questions are, what is a placebo drug, and what is a phase one? What are the side effects of being in a phase one? So, Dr. Pruitt, I'll direct those questions towards you, but I can definitely take on some as well. But
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. Which was the first question? What is a placebo? So
what is a placebo?
Was it okay? Placebo is basically giving a clinical trial participant a medicine that has no medicinal purpose or no medicinal means to work. It basically is a form of what we call a blinding. We don't want to make the participant think they're getting no drug, so we give them what we call a placebo to make them think they're getting some medication, but it's basically just a part of the medication process that has no medicinal medicine in that, which is placebo.
Yeah, and I want to tie that into a statement you made earlier, Dr. Pruitt, where there's concern with folks who participate in clinical trials, and they're concerned of whether they're getting a placebo or active drug. And I really want to like highlight, especially for cancer, when we talk about prostate cancer, that there's not necessarily placebos used in that group. So can you talk more to how clinical trials are designed, where they're randomized for either like the current gold standard of treatment versus a new therapy, to kind of just remind folks that again, it's not always going to be a placebo versus drug. There are different variations of randomization.
Right, there are different variations. So something like cancer, to get approval for that, usually you're going to enter in 2 treatment groups as opposed to if you're finding out something, for example, like hypertension, which you can live for a long time with, but you just need to control it. Cancer is a lot more serious. And so depending on how that study design is laid out, one group may get 1% of the treatment and the other group may get a different percentage, and they may look at the different percentages to treat that particular cancer. Most studies would kind of not treat a cancer person. They would give them something. Not real good ethical etiquette to not treat something. So that's a lot different than if you're just trying to look at an antibiotic that cures, pneumonia or something to that degree. So please understand that if it's a serious disease, you're usually going to be entered into 2 treatment groups. One will get one and one will get another, probably at different doses, just to see which dose is more effective, which dose may send the cancer into remission, which dose may be more suppressive, and which dose more and particularly is less side effects.
Mhm. Thank you
Yeah.
for that. And I know we didn't talk in advance about this, but I want to maybe highlight precision medicine and why that's such a big field of research and study now. Because one of the questions in our chat is, how does a clinical trial drug compare to the current standard treatments? And we kind of just talked about that now. But
Mhm.
again, like why, if we have a drug already for the indication of hypertension, why have another drug for hypertension? Why the nuances and development of similar drugs within different therapeutic areas?
In general, in clinical trials, once pharmaceutical companies bring a medication to the market, they usually bring it to the market because it has some advantage over the previous hypertensive med, if we stick onto that example. You do your comparative, like we said, in phase 3, and you'll look at to have some advantage. Now, the advantage can be many. You can control hypertension better. It can have less side effects. It can have better control of various different things. So usually when someone brings something to the market, they bring it because it's an advantage for the disease state of hypertension. They just won't bring it just to say, hey, I'm drug A, B, and C. Here's D. Because that doesn't help us. They usually have an advantage, and that is it's an advantage over our standard of care, or it brings some wrinkle that maybe the other medications don't cover.
Thank you for that. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's another question here. What stage of disease should I have to participate in a clinical trial?
That depends. Now, that's a hard question to ask because disease states come in so many levels, and I would call the clinical trial people and talk to them. They may be. I'll give you an example. They may be looking at people, and we're going to stick with our hypertension model. They might be looking at somebody who just has essential hypertension. They may be looking at somebody who has severe hypertension. They may be looking at somebody who has uncontrollable hypertension. It just depends on what they're looking at the time for their study drug and what they're trying to accomplish. But there are just so many layers of disease state that they may take everybody and just show what advantage their medication can show across a broad spectrum of diseases, so to speak.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I do just want to remind the audience too that in a lot of our trials, like phase 2 trials, you may see recruitment of healthy volunteers. So like let's say we are studying that hypertensive drug. We may want to recruit folks who don't have a diagnosis of high blood pressure, just to see how the medication works and what the potential side effects are in that healthy, again, patient group versus, when it comes to actually doing a randomization and rolling folks who have the designated health condition or disease state. So you will see some opportunities for, recruitment for healthy folks. So
Hmm.
minus any diagnosis to participate in clinical trials.
And if everybody remembers, like you said, that's phase 1 where we
Mhm.
study it in healthy patients.
So I know we had talked before, Dr. Pruitt, about the time commitment that folks sometimes encounter with dealing with clinical trials and time off of work and transportation. And I know from a sponsor perspective, working for a pharma company that sponsor clinical trials, we have built in some models for reimbursement for participants if that is something that's going to be a barrier to their participation. But there is a question here in the chat, like what is the average time commitment for one who chooses to participate in a clinical trial?
The time commitment is going to vary. I'm not going to lie, it's going to vary. Some clinical trials involve may involve blood draws. Some may be, if we go back to our hypertensive model once again, coming in and getting your blood pressure taken, which won't take that long. Some may be having a doctor look over you and do a quick physical, or a nurse practitioner doing a quick physical just to make sure everything is okay with you. Ongoing monitoring can vary in time. It can be fairly quick and it can be extensive depending on the disease state and how deep they are looking at the disease and establishing what they're trying to do. So let me give you an example. So hypertension involves, like we said, maybe just taking your blood pressure. Something a little bit more involved, such as cancer, you're going to look at blood draws. We're going to be looking at markers. We're going to be looking at levels. We're going to do electrolytes. We're going to do chems and metabolic panels. And those things are all due to the deep involvement of cancer. Unfortunately, it's just a lot more involved. So you have to expect to stay a little longer and have a little deeper monitoring than say just coming in and take your blood pressure and say, oh yeah, this medicine's working pretty good. Your blood pressure's been controlled and we've been good, as opposed to something like oncology, which is a lot more involved. Even HIV is a lot more involved too. Just a lot more things that you have to look at uh, differently than and closely than some of the other disease states. So it can vary.
Thank you for that. And along the same line, there's a question in the chat. Are there any out-of-pocket costs that come along with participating in a clinical trial? And so I'm guessing this is maybe from an insurance perspective. Is there any costs to a patient who's potentially uninsured when it comes to being in a clinical trial?
In general, no, and I'm gonna bounce that back to you, Dr. Burress, because you know that drug companies pay a siphon. They don't charge you to be in it because nobody would be in a clinical trial. They had to pay to be in it. So most large companies reimburse you for your time, and I think you alluded to that earlier. You had said a little bit that siphons are available for dispersion. Also, no insurance. You can't bill insurance if you have some type of insurance. You can't bill the insurance for clinical trials. And I'll bounce that back to you. I hope that answers the question, but I think you can give a little bit more insight on that coming
Yeah,
from
no,
the.
yes, definitely, and thank you for backing me up on that. So yes, no, there should be no out-of-pocket costs when it comes to being a participant in clinical trials. And if you do encounter issues, that's why we have clinical trial site monitors and managers who are able to thwart those issues for participants who do encounter such. But there should be no out-of-pocket expense for participants. Thank you. Let's see, what is another question? Can I expect my condition to improve from participating in a clinical trial?
That depends, and the answer is yes and no. And the reason I say yes and no, if the drug that they're studying is effective and really taking care of that disease state that they're studying, and you may see some advantage. And then that is the reason for having clinical trials, so that we can see what drugs may offer an advantage to people. And that is the yes answer. The no is it may not. And so if we have a clinical trial, we can find out what molecules, drug molecules, actually give an advantage and which don't. And the ones that don't, we don't want to bring to the market. So I know that's a yes or no answer, but that is the answer. Yes, if that drug actually is showing some beneficial assets to that disease state, yeah, you can have a good outcome. And if it's not, you may have no outcome.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Dr. Pruitt, I know you and I have talked before at today's webinar, but sometimes I share my own experience with clinical trials. And so I am a breast cancer patient, and I am in a clinical trial through a pharma company who I'm not employed by. And I do know when we talked before about some of the barriers to participation, I shared with Dr. Pruitt and I share with others when I have this conversation is that clinical trials were never offered to me as part of my treatment plan. So, I'm thankful that I do this work to have this conversation to show that it's not just always sometimes access. It's sometimes those implicit biases that may come from the healthcare providers that, are managing our care. So the more that we can learn about clinical trials and what the options are, again, the more that we can empower ourselves to make better choices for our health outcomes. But Dr. Pruitt, I want to bounce that off of you. Like, how does one like if I weren't a pharmacist, I probably would not have known to go out and seek my own clinical trial. So what do we do for those who are engaged in, relationships with their primary care physician or their cardiologist or oncologist, and clinical trials are not coming up as an option? How do we help folks who are in that scenario?
Yeah, that's a good point. Like you said, you had the knowledge being a pharmacist to know where to look. Ask your healthcare provider. I always start there. Ask them if there are any clinical trials. I know several participants, like you said, who had breast cancer, who entered into clinical trials. Unfortunately, usually for Black women, they suffer disproportionately from triple negative breast cancer, and they just don't have enough Black women entering through the trials. But that is starting to change, and a lot of the women that did enter into some of those triple negative breast cancer studies got that information from the healthcare provider. Your oncologist would know some trials. You can also look on the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. They always have what clinical trials they've approved and different things. And I think at the end of tonight, you'll put people in contact with some sites that may help them if they have any questions. And I'll save that for the end, that you can direct some people to some different areas where they can get some resources to find out what's going on and what may help them.
Yeah, thank you for queuing that up. So the website is researchincludesme.com, and it's just a resource for folks, us normal folks who just want to go find out more information, like how Dr. Pruitt went through the different phases of clinical trials and, defined what a IRB is and what are the different safety protocols that we have in place now for clinical trials. So it's a great resource for those who want to seek more information. And again, like Dr. Pruitt said, we will show that at the end of our presentation. But I want to bring my personal narrative into this conversation because the question was asked, can a clinical trial improve my condition? And, like Dr. Pruitt said, most of the times it's a yes, but do know that clinical trials are often the most cutting edge opportunity for exposure to new, state of the art drug therapies and treatment. So, if you find yourself in a space where you could be a candidate for such, please pursue, have a conversation with your physician. Even if they don't bring it up, you bring it up with them, because you never know what being a participant in a clinical trial, how that can benefit you. Let's see, I'm going to go back to some more questions in the chat. So Dr. Pruitt, there's a question. What are some strategies to find providers who conduct clinical trials in our African American communities?
Say it again. Read the question again. I'm sorry. The first part.
Yeah. What are some strategies to find a provider who conduct clinical trials in our African American communities?
Actually, that's a good question, and what we've been looking at is trying to get more of our minority healthcare providers to enter into those clinical trials. I think I mentioned that tonight. If we have more people that look like us, we're more likely to do it. I would ask healthcare providers that you have in your area. Some cities around the country usually have a minority health organization, be it a Black Nurses Association, a Black Medical Association, a Black Pharmacists Association, and those are some good places to start because you'll have all the resources right there, and they usually all the physicians, doctors, pharmacists, and nurses all know each other in the general area, and they can spread that information quite readily and probably get that answer to you more judiciously than somebody who's not in our community. Is a great way, I find out, to just to do that through our Black healthcare organizations.
Okay, there we go. That conversation starts with your physician. So again, if they don't bring it up, you bring up that you're interested in a clinical trial. Let's see. Another question is, if you leave a clinical trial, are you monitored if you've been given an active drug?
Usually you are monitored for a certain period of time. I'll bounce that back to you, Dr. Burress, but I know, you have to be monitored for a certain amount of time, and you usually are monitored for a certain amount of time. That amount of time depends on how much of the drug you received or what phase you were in. If you were in phase one, it may be quick, short monitoring. If you made it all the way to phase three and decided to drop out, then you may have a longer monitoring period. Go ahead, Dr. Burgess. I know that's your area. So
Yes. So on average, the typical standard is 2 years of follow-up, just to make sure that, again, we identify the nuances, if there are any side effects that maybe weren't experienced early on in therapy, to follow folks and see if their health condition is improving. But yeah, 2 years on average is the follow-up when you participate in a clinical trial.
okay,
Very
great.
good. All right, I'm trying to see if I missed any questions here, but thank you all of those who are in attendance, because these are great questions that are coming through. I guess there's a question here. How does a clinical trial work? I'm not sure how to answer that one, Dr. Pruitt.
How does it work? So it goes through, I don't know where they came in as far as the meeting, but the phase one, phase two, phase three, and phase four, as we said earlier. Phase one being healthy volunteers. Just summing up real quick, phase two, people with the disease. Phase three, we get it out to safety and different things, and safety throughout phase one, two, and three. Phase four is post-marketing, monitoring, and different aspects. So it goes through the clinical trials. They set it up. They recruit patients, they study the drug for safety, dosage, efficacy, and then they put it on the market and continue to monitor it post-marketing, what they call phase four.
Very good. Thank you. Another question that came through, it's what's wrong with not participating in clinical trials?
What's wrong with not clinical? Okay, so as a minority healthcare professional, I often hear us complain that the studies aren't geared towards our diseases and our disease states. And so one of the reasons we need to do clinical trials is that our problems are addressed point blank, and so that we have our things that are important to us met, and that they're studied in our population. It's nothing wrong with not doing it. It's just that how do we obtain data to know that medications work better in a particular ethnic group? And so let me give you a quick example for the person who asked that question. I'll give you a particular example, and I'm going to stay on my hypertension example. There was some clinical trials that came out a while ago that actually showed Black people don't do well with a particular medicine called ACE inhibitors, that we actually respond better for our hypertension with diuretics, and that white people do better with ACE inhibitors because they make a disproportionate amount of ACE inhibitors. Well, prior to that study and that information coming out, we had a lot of Black people put on ACE inhibitors, which wasn't maximizing their hypertension and controlling it. So once we've learned those little things, like you said, nuances, and learn things like that, we can go in and get treatment that's particular to us and that helps our particular disease state and is more advantageous for us as a people. And I hope that answers the question. So yes, not being in it means we kind of surf on the general population, and if it works for us, it works, and if it don't, it don't. But if we enter in, we can get some point specific treatment that works directly for us in our community.
Thank you. That was such a great example because that shows you the impact that clinical trials have on guidelines that we use for treating certain health conditions, right? Our guidelines
Absolutely.
are gold standard, but here we discovered this in a clinical trial setting and it shifts the paradigm for a treatment for high blood pressure in our community. So thank you for sharing that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Let's see. Okay, so another question. Will I be able to keep my doctor or will I have to get a new set of doctors when I'm in a clinical trial?
That's an easy one. If you enter a clinical trial, that doctor who's taking care of you in a clinical trial will be in direct contact with your primary care physician, and they'll be talking to them. They're going to communicate. You don't have to drop your primary care physician if you enter a clinical trial. Matter of fact, the primary care physician will be a key asset for getting your history and learning all the different things about you that may help the physician who's conducting the clinical trial have more information about you. So definitely can keep your doctor and the clinical trial physician and your primary care physician or whatever physician you have will actually probably speak at some point and talk. So yes, you don't have to drop your primary care physician to enter a clinical trial.
Thank you for that. Wow, well, this has been great. Let's see, we got about 8 minutes left. Let's see, maybe I'll try to squeeze in one more question before we start to close out tonight's event. There's a question about interpreting the data. How do the sponsors and organizers of the clinical trial interpret the data once it's been collected?
The data is interpreted by statisticians. The statisticians they look at the things they crunch. They're the number crunchers, and then they also publish a paper. And the physicians, I'm not a statistician, but I can read a journal. I've written many of them, and I know what clinical significance is and what it's not. And so I can get through a paper, and I'm sure Dr. Burgess, you can get through one also, and know if it's a junk study, as we call them, that's junk, or if it's a good clinical, tight, randomized clinical trial with good data and validity and no type 1, type 2 errors, and it's really a solid study. Most physicians can get through that, and the number of people really do just the data part. But your doctors, pharmacists, and nurses, we interpret that clinically for our information and usage as we develop, like you said, clinical standards out in the workforce.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it kind of ties into what you mentioned earlier about the retention in clinical trials. It's one thing to get folks in the door, but we really
Mhm.
need to make sure that we have the provisions in place to make sure that they successfully complete the trial, especially if we're talking about trials that go for 2 years or more. So, very important. Thank you for answering that. And with that, I guess I'll go ahead and wrap up. This has been a great conversation. I thank you, Dr. Pruitt, for going through this data and going through the questions and answer session with me. I hope all who've been in attendance walk away again with some new insights, some pearls of wisdom that not only you have for yourself, but that you can share with your family, your loved ones, and let's keep this momentum going so that we can truly drive impact with our community when it comes to our health outcomes. So again, thank you, Dr. Pruitt, for
Thank
engagement in
you.
this conversation. I want to say thank you to our partners, the Omega Psi Phi Fraternity, Sigma Phi Chapter in Montgomery, Alabama. And we're going to have a few words from Mr. Snap, if you want to come through.
Hello, how y'all doing today?
Great.
All right, good. This is Michael Snap with Sigma Phi Chapter. I just want to thank everybody for coming on, enjoying the information and gathering, getting more knowledge. We continue to work with Black Health Matter. This is our second year, and we continue to work with them and continue to look forward for more information. And, in regards to the Omega Psi Phi for our fraternity, we're working well into the community, and we like to keep everybody informed to help them out health-wise as well to continue on with their life in this pandemic area and everything else that's going on. Thank you again.
Thank you. And again, for more information, please visit the website noted here below, researchincludesme.com. But again, just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Pruitt, for this conversation. And I hope that we can partner again soon, because I'm sure there's going to be more questions that come through that we haven't been able to answer. But, it's been a pleasure serving the stage or sharing the stage with you this evening. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thank Black Health Matters also for having me.
Yeah, and so with that, we want to remind you to visit blackhealthmatters.com and subscribe so that you get updates on all the initiatives that are going on with Black Health Matters. And again, I thank you guys for this platform. I thank you for this conversation. Enjoy us on the next live stream event that should be coming soon. And to all, good night.
Good night.